Hello, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. I want to thank my hosts for inviting me here and for so graciously taking care of me and babysitting me in the day or so that I've been here so far. I am indeed going to speak about two topics today, work, family policy, and women's employment being one of them, and the distribution of income across households being the other. I was asked to speak about these two together, and I'm happy to do so, even though they're not so often paired. Why am I happy to put them together? Well, first, I've studied women's employment and work-family policy for about 20 years, and then in the last 3 years, I've turned my attention to inequality across households. Second, there's a link between these two topics, one that's constituting a growing area of study, although it's really not very well understood. Of course, women's earnings are part of the household income package, and this is the question that's being asked more and more, is what is the relationship between women's strengthening attachment to the labor market and the pattern of income inequality across households? And it turns out that the answer to that question is actually somewhat unexpected and counterintuitive, and I'll come back to it at the end of my discussion. And third, we are indeed in Sweden, as you've heard from the two earlier speakers. And both of these areas, Sweden has attracted a lot of attention, understandably, from international scholars. It has been the iconic case for many years of work-family reconciliation policy and gender equality in the labor market. And it has also been a case much studied and admired in terms of inequality of income across households, although that's much less true today than it was in the past. Whoops. Okay, so a quick overview of what I'm going to do today. Very much a flyover from 30,000 meters since time is tight. I'm going to talk about what do we mean when we speak of work-family reconciliation policy, and what in fact is provided across a group of affluent countries. I'm going to talk briefly about what is it that we know about the impact of these policies, about their consequences, both intended and unintended, and then I'm going to come to the household income distribution and cycle back and put them together. What do we mean by work-family reconciliation policy? It means many different things across the literature, but I would argue that there is essentially this set of levers that we think of as the policy package that affects the ease with which parents reconcile their responsibilities in paid work and their responsibilities in parenting. So first of all, paid leave, family leave of various sorts, which we'll come back to. The next four on the list are various forms of the regulation of working time, which is a very important part of the policy package that affects the ease with which people reconcile work and family responsibility. And then finally, earlyhood child education and care. So I'm going to go through and give you a very quick overview of what policy variation looks like across the United States and 12 European countries. And as I do that, I'm going to emphasize the Swedish case, which is, in many cases, you'll see a high provider. I'm also going to emphasize the US case. It's a case I know well, and one I'm afraid that is not overwhelmingly admirable. Okay, leave policy. Something that we've learned in recent years is that leave, and by leave I mean the whole family of packages, the whole family of policies of maternity, paternity, parental leave, and various variations on that. It's very complicated to measure these leave schemes, so I'm going to reduce it to just two different dimensions and recognize the fact that these schemes can be compared in many ways. So one thing we've learned in recent years is the generosity of these programs is different from the extent to which they encourage gender egalitarian take-up. So this is a measure. This slide here shows the generosity. It's from a paper in the Journal of European Social Policy that I prepared with two colleagues. And what we show here is the amount of leave that's available to mothers. It's just one particular way to measure this. If they were to take all of the leave that's granted to them through the maternity schemes, and also the maximum that they could take through the parental leave scheme. The total bar there includes unpaid leave, meaning job protection. The darker portion of the bar captures what we call full-time equivalent leave, which is essentially the wage replacement rate times the duration. So 80% pay at 10 weeks, for 10 weeks would be the same as 100% pay at 8 weeks using this scale. So what you see, of course, Sweden is a moderate provider in the total, but very much a high provider when we look at the full-time equivalent leave. The United States nearly falls off the chart there, as I think you can see on the right-hand side. The United States is one of 4 countries in the world that has no national policy requiring paid maternity leave. The other 3 are Lesotho, Swaziland, and Papua New Guinea. Another way that we measure leave, though, is we look deep into the policy architecture to understand the ways in which these leave policies both enable and encourage male take-up. So with my colleagues, we created a 15-point scale, and this is measuring the law, the way that the law is designed. So it's sort of complicated, you can read the paper, but we assign 9 points to each system to capture the extent to which leave is granted to men and also non-transferable to their female partners. And we granted another 5 points for the degree of wage replacement. The higher the wage replacement, the greater the incentive for take-up, and then a 15th point for particular policy designs. And what you see here is that gender equality, the gender egalitarian nature and the generosity are distinct, although they tend to be correlated, and the Nordic countries are often both generous and gender egalitarian, Sweden being the most extreme case here. The United States is in the middle of the pack. While we do have no paid leave, we have an unpaid leave law, and it's allocated symmetrically between men and women. Working time. We talked about this, you've heard about this from another speaker here. In the United States, we don't discuss this very much as part of the work-family reconciliation package, but it is very much part of the discussion in Europe, and this picture captures very simply 2 levers, the length of the standard work week and the number of days of paid leave that are allocated either through average levels of collective bargaining, or through the national law. So what we see, Sweden about the middle of the pack with a more or less 37-hour standard work week and about 25 days of leave. The United States, of course, the other end of the scale there, 40-hour standard work week. That's the overtime threshold, untouched in 70 years. And US law is silent on days off per year. Not surprisingly, among all these countries, Americans work the longest number of hours per year. Rights to flexible work schemes, a very important part of the story here. Many European countries have put in place since 2000 laws granting parents, actually granting various categories of workers, either an automatic right to flexible work or the right to request, and you see that there are multiple channels through which Swedish workers can request flexible work hours. US law is, unfortunately, again, silent. Early childhood education and care, one that we know much more about. Its consequences are really fairly well known. And what we see here is quite a lot of variation across countries, especially in what this graph shows is the percentage of children who are in formal care. The white bar are the under 3s, and the yellow bar is the 3 to 5. And you see there, again, quite a lot of variation. In the Swedish case, formal child care is fairly extensive. For the older children, we're seeing near universal coverage in many countries. The United States, again, unfortunately, provides very little formal care, especially very little publicly provided care. We might come back to this later in the discussion. That 56% is almost entirely 5-year-olds. It's the 3- and 4-year-olds in the United States who are very minimally served in formal care. Enormously quick flyover. That's the view from 30,000 meters of work-family reconciliation policy across the European countries and including the US. What do we know about the policy effects? Well, obviously, correlation doesn't establish causality, but we do know that there's a very large social science literature now using many different kinds of designs that have connected these policies. Sorry, I realize I'm echoing here, have connected these policies with their outcomes. I reviewed this literature in a paper recently with my colleague Ariane Hagevish. And what we do know from a very large literature, as I said, is that generous and gender egalitarian work and family reconciliation policies secure women's employment, especially among women with children. So we've seen that over time across countries and in a whole variety of design. So I will show you, though, what this looks like in terms of the correlations between these policies and some of the European cases. So first of all, a very simple and somewhat clunky, though, indicator of work-family reconciliation, the capacity of these policies, is in fact the women's labor force participation rate as of 2010. Of course, we see the Nordic countries still fairly well known near the top, Sweden at nearly 77%, the United States down at 68%. Something that is interesting is for quite a few years, the Nordic countries were marked by very high rates of women's labor force participation, but also very high rates of part-time work among those who were employed. And it was often said that it was the high rates of part-time work that enabled the high levels of labor force participation. But that pattern is no longer the case. As you can see, in most of the Nordic countries, actually part-time work among employed women now at the 30-hour cutoff is relatively low, about 19% in Sweden, about the same in the US. The Netherlands is a very strong counterexample, also of relatively high women's labor force participation, but exceptionally high rates of part-time work, so big gender gaps in hours worked. This is an indicator that I've used for many years. This comes from the LIST data, the Luxembourg Income Study, now referred to as LIST. That's the institute that I direct. What I've done here is to put together a composite indicator that allows us to think in sort of general terms about the extent to which women have penetrated the labor market. So it's simply the share of all labor market earnings that are taken home by women. And the panel on the side are adults in all family types, and the panel on the right are married parents with children under 12. So what you see here, and again, a general correlation, but the story is fairly strong. The 6 cases that we understand in Europe to be those with the most generous and most gender egalitarian work-family reconciliation policy are in fact the 4 Nordic countries that you see here, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Norway, as well as France and Belgium. And these 6 cases are, in fact, the cases where we do see that women are earning the largest share of the labor market, especially partnered women with children. So what that means in those countries is women are indeed receiving the largest share of earnings, and they're also the least dependent on the fathers of their children. This is, of course, just showing heterosexual couples. For now. It's not particularly contested that these are the 6 most generous and gender egalitarian cases. I don't think that's anything that most of us don't know. There are also, which maybe we'll come back to in the discussion, 6 cases with the highest fertility, and now a marker that many of us understand also to capture the extent to which it's possible to reconcile work and family. The final picture here in my slides about gender equality and outcomes. This is from a study of housework. Somebody's raised this question about domestic labor. And this is measured in a very particular way. Again, heterosexual couples looking at the difference between husbands and wives and hours spent in domestic work. And the case with the most gender parity of this in this study, indeed, is Sweden. Okay. Actually, I'm going to skip this. So, one of the biggest discussions in the literature these days about work-family reconciliation policy raises the question of unintended consequences. This is a discussion that's been filling the academic literature and a lot of popular debate as well. So this is the question that we're hearing, are really 2 questions. Do generous work-family reconciliation policies possibly worsen some forms of gender inequality or lead to new forms? Specifically, is it possible that they're lowering the glass ceiling or making it more impenetrable? A recent study that came out of the US got a lot of attention in academia and in the popular press. This was by the labor economist Blau and Kahn from 2013, and this is what they found. So they argued in 1990, the United States had the 6th highest female labor force participation rate among 22 OECD countries, but in the later years, the rank had fallen to 17th. So using a rather complicated methodological design, they concluded 2 things. One was that it was the United States' lagging work-family policy compared to the growth of these policies in other countries that caused the US to move way down in the rankings in terms of women's labor force participation and also the gender ratio of labor force participation. But at the same time, they raised this conclusion, exactly as I'm saying that many people have been discussing, and they argued, though, that there was a trade-off, that the generous work-family policy that was seen in the Nordic countries, especially in France and Belgium, was leading to to lowering the glass ceiling and making it more impenetrable. And they gave this as evidence, and this was redone as a graph in the New York Times and got a lot of attention. So these were 2 pieces of evidence that they presented. So they looked, the lighter bars represent the United States, the blue are men, the pink are women, the darker bars represent the rest of the OECD averaged. So the left panel there shows the probability of people holding managerial positions, and in the right panel, the probability of women in male-dominated professions. So what they argued here was that what we see is that in the United States, despite its fairly unimpressive the fairly unimpressive findings with regard to gender parity in labor force participation, and the gender wage gaps, of course, are also quite large in the US. But what they argued is there seems to be a trade-off, that in fact in these other countries, maybe women are being killed with kindness, is what the phrase that we often hear, that in fact there seems to be some sort of damage done to the top of the labor market. What do I say about these findings? I think these are is of course a very important area of study. One I might add that has a lot of potency in the popular press, and especially in the United States, which is so famous for its extremely limited work-family policy. I must say this argument, I think, has been quite damaging. So what is my view about this? I think this is a really important question, and I think a lot more work is needed to assess and document these findings. I think also very important is that we understand the causality. It's not clear what that is. Is it operating on the supply side or the demand side or both? The story that's told typically is that in a case like Sweden, when there's so much generous work-family policy, when workers have the right to take leave, to take flexible time, to take time off until their children are 8, and so forth, the take-up is disproportionately female. That's true. So the argument is that somebody in a position to hire and to promote is more likely to choose the male candidate, all else equal, with the concern that the female counterpart, right, will be in and out of full-time work, whereas in the United States, there's very little opportunity for anybody, so it acts as a leveler, that everybody's going to work full-time, full year. So it may have some, there may be less statistical discrimination on the part of employers for that reason. I think that's a really crucial question, something that I would urge everyone in the field to keep looking at. But I would also argue that I think it's important to remember that there are distributional questions at work here, that it may in fact be the case. I think we don't know this yet, but it may be the case that certain elements of generous work-family reconciliation policy in fact create some harm at the top. That's possible. It might be that there's some disadvantageous effects for the top 10%, while these programs may be much more unambiguously advantageous for the bottom 90. People often ask me this, I might add. My students in the US were very taken in the last presidential election when they kept hearing that the United States, they kept hearing from our conservative candidates, that the United States has the best healthcare system in the world, which I think is a dubious proposition, if I may say so. But what I used to say indeed, or what I do say to my students is, yes, if you're rich and you have a rare brain tumor, you might want to be in the US, but you're a single mother with an asthmatic kid, you probably want to be anywhere else. So it's a distributional question, and I think the same thing is something we should think about here. Okay, if I haven't made you terribly dizzy, I'm going to shift to the question of income inequality across households, and then cycle back at the end and link these two topics together. Okay. I have to take just a moment to market a new book. As the director of the Luxembourg Income Study, I, with the research director, Marcus Yanti, who's at Sophie and is somewhere in the room here, we just co-edited a volume of 17 studies based on the data from the Luxembourg Income Study. So there's a book flyer here somewhere. I encourage you all to buy it and read it right away. And it's coming out in paperback this summer if you want to save a few pennies and wait until July. Nevertheless, what this book does is summarize many, many new findings on income inequality that have come from our data, and I'm going to tell you a little bit in the next just remaining few minutes, and also some OECD findings as well. This is a rather classic graph from research. The Luxembourg Income Study, for those of you who don't know, is a data archive in Luxembourg. We gather microdata sets from around the world and harmonize them and make them available for comparative research. So these are findings from the LIS database. You saw a picture something like this based on poverty, I think, from the SILK data. So what you see here is, this again reports findings from the LIS data on levels of inequality. The longer bars report inequality in market income. That's income before taxes and transfers have been accounted for. And the shorter bars report inequality in what's often referred to as disposable income. That's household income adjusted for household size after we take account of taxes and transfers. Of course, the market income distribution is a fictional distribution. This is really just an accounting exercise, but it helps us see in quite dramatic terms the way in which the state helps to fill in what the market doesn't provide. So what do we see here? Inequality levels vary quite a lot across these countries. And the levels of redistribution is captured as the difference between the two bars, of course, also vary a great deal as well. So after taxes and transfers, if we take a look at the two cases I've been highlighting today, after taxes and transfers, the United States is the most unequal with the Gini. This is the Gini coefficient, a fairly well-known measure of inequality most of you are familiar with. After taxes and transfers, the Gini in the US is about 0.37. And as of 2005, the most recent microdata that we have from Sweden, much more favorable at about 0.23. We also see that redistribution in Sweden, as has been noted before, I think in the example compared, when you looked at it compared to, I think, Latvia and Slovenia. So this, again, is well-known findings for those of us working in the field here, that redistribution is a substantial factor leading to the low inequality of disposable income in Sweden. The market inequality puts Sweden a little closer to the middle of the pack, but it's the combination of moderate market inequality and generous, although declining, redistribution that has put Sweden near the bottom. Got my eye on the clock here. Okay, what about over time? What do we know about the trends here? I'm going to shift to a finding from the OECD report where there's some inequality data available for later years. So it's now really quite well known that in the last 3 decades, inequality has risen in many affluent countries. And in fact, it's risen in about 2/3 of the OECD countries. And that includes both of the countries that I focused on today. You see the OECD average in the middle. The United States, of course, with high and rising inequality, is the top series there. And Sweden is the series below. So what we've learned here, I think that many of you know this. I think this is becoming just well known outside of Sweden, I would say. As our colleagues at the OECD have noted, Sweden still belongs to the group of the 9 most equal OECD countries, despite a rapid surge of income inequality in the early 1990s. Furthermore, important to note, the growth in inequality between 1985 and the late 2000s in Sweden was the largest among all the OECD countries, increasing by about 1/3. The distribution is shifting its shape, something we see here, a table from a study done using our data, the list data, looked at the size of the middle class in 2005, and that's defined in this particular study as households which have income between 75% and 125% of the median. And what you see here is, as of 2005, it's still the case that Sweden, along with Norway and Denmark, has the largest middle class, according to this definition, just over half the population. But it's also the case that the size of the middle class in Sweden fell in the prior 20 years by nearly 7 percentage points, and that's the largest decline among all of these countries. And finally, indeed, the top is rising. It's rising in many countries, and it's rising here. This also, the Piketty data, so-called, from the World Top Incomes database. And what we see here is that, turning again to the Swedish case, Sweden's richest 1% of earners saw their share of total pre-tax income nearly double from 4% in 1980 to 7% in 2008. If capital gains are included, it's 9%. During that same time, that's pre-tax income. It's also the case that the top marginal income tax rate dropped from 87% in 1979 to 56% in 2008. We can see the components of rising income inequality in those pictures. So just to wrap up, let me come back to where I started, that these two topics, I argue, are related. This is an OECD observation, happened to be using the Luxembourg income study data, and this is their summation of what happened in Sweden going back to the demography. So they note that societal change, the rise of single-person and single-parent households, and also the rise of people partnering with those similar to them in the labor force, accounts for a rather moderate part of the increase in household earnings inequality, about a quarter. But they note the widening dispersion of men's earnings was the more important factor, and at the same time, this is important, the higher employment rates for women helped to reduce household earnings inequality by about the same amount. So it's women's increasing employment is tamping down on what would otherwise be an even larger increase in income inequality. Why is that? Because increasing women's employment is pulling up the bottom of the distribution. That's something that has happened in Sweden. And to close, one of the chapters in our book by Susan Harkness, a British economist, asked that same question across 20 rich countries using our data, and she found that to be a universal finding. As she notes here, assessing the influence of female earnings on inequality, she found that female employment is an important factor in reducing earnings inequality across couples in all households. So to close on that point then, despite some popular wisdom to the contrary, it's often argued that women's increasing penetration into paid work is disequalizing. The empirical evidence indicates the reverse. And why is that? It's because women's increased earnings are pulling up the bottom more substantially than they're pushing up the top. So women's increasing connection to the labor force also has the added benefit of mitigating the increasing inequality in men's earnings and its effect on inequality in household income. So to conclude, for those of us interested in work-family policy and gender equality in the labor market on the one hand, and income inequality on the other, it's always wise to consider the two together. Thank you.